We're now moving to our second keynote, our lunchtime keynote with Robert Einhorn, and we're very glad that he can join us today. He's now a senior fellow with the Arms Control Initiative and the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, which are both housed within the Foreign Policy Program of the Brookings Institution. He focuses on arms control, nonproliferation, and regional security issues, including Iran, the Greater Middle East, South Asia, and Northeast Asia, and U.S. nuclear weapons policies and programs. And he has had a long and distinguished career in the United States government. Before he moved to Brookings in May of this year, he served as the State Department's Special Advisor for Nonproliferation and Arms Control, which was a position that was created by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in 2009. And in that capacity, he played a leading role in the formulation and execution of U.S. policy toward Iran, toward its nuclear program, both with respect to sanctions and negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 countries. And also played a key role in shaping the Obama administration's overall policies toward nonproliferation. Prior to that, he was a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, where he directed the Proliferation Prevention Program. And before that, he served in several different capacities in the Department of State, Assistant Secretary of State for Nonproliferation, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, and prior to that, he was at the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Association. So again, a very distinguished career, and we are delighted to welcome you here today.
Angela, thank you very much for the introduction, for inviting me to address this, this conference. I'm going to talk about the Iran nuclear issue, and I'll start by talking about the transition in the Iranian leadership, at least at the governmental level, the presidential level. The June presidential election, where Rouhani got a clear majority, was elected on the first ballot, has had a significant impact on the handling of the nuclear issue and negotiations between Iran and the P5+1. You know, those are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. The previous leadership in Iran prior to the election, in my view, wasn't very serious about the negotiations, about reaching agreement. I think they were really in a state of denial about the impact of the economic sanctions imposed on Iran by the international community. I think there was too much confidence that they could weather the sanctions. They could find workarounds, that the U.S. and Europe and the rest of the international sanctions community would eventually develop sanctions fatigue, and that eventually the sanctions would wither away. They even used the rationale that the sanctions were beneficial to Iran because they encouraged self-reliance, and that way Iran can wean itself away from its dependence on crude oil exports. Because of this, I think this underestimation of the impact of the sanctions, they didn't feel a strong imperative to come to agreement with the P5+1 countries. Of course, they were prepared to have an agreement if an agreement could have been achieved on their terms, but they weren't very much interested in making concessions. They hoped they could have their cake and eat it too, an unfettered nuclear program, as well as the removal of sanctions. I think since the election of President Rouhani, we have a very different approach from Iran. I think Rouhani and his advisors are much more realistic, much more pragmatic. They understand the predicament their economy is in. When they came in, they took a look at the books and they saw that things were bad and getting worse, with revenues from the sale of crude oil dropping well below 50% of what they had been just a couple of years ago, inflation soaring, unemployment increasing in key sectors such as the auto industry, of which the Iranians are very proud, with no reputable banks around the world prepared to do business with Iran. The situation was growing dire, and the new team understood this, and they understood that getting the economy back on track really required the international sanctions to be scaled back and eventually removed. They understood that part of the problem in the Iranian economy was due to the mismanagement by President Ahmadinejad and his key advisors, but they also knew that sanctions were heavily responsible for the economic situation. And they also were realistic enough to know that they weren't going to get these sanctions removed without reaching an accommodation on the nuclear issue. And achieving an accommodation on the nuclear issue required a more moderate, more flexible approach than their predecessors had adopted. So this was all in very sharp contrast to the pre-June 2013 leadership in Iran. Now, this doesn't mean that the Iranians are going to be willing to make huge concessions at the negotiating table. After all, the ultimate decision maker in Iran on all things nuclear is the supreme leader, Khamenei. And he is, I think, ideologically indisposed to making concessions to the West, even engaging with the West. I think Khamenei believes that engagement could ultimately result in the unraveling of the Islamic revolution. So he's very wary, would prefer to, I think, avoid a deal on the nuclear issue. But by now, I think he probably recognizes that the economic situation of the country is getting pretty desperate. And so I think he's probably grudgingly allowed President Rouhani and his team to try out their approach of moderation and flexibility, and to see whether that is any more successful than the defiant, resistance-based approach that the prior team had adopted. I think his instructions, the leader's instructions to Rouhani and Rouhani's team, were probably very simple. It would be, get the international sanctions removed, get the P5 +1 to accept Iran's uranium enrichment program, and do these things at minimal cost to Iran's nuclear program and Iran's future nuclear options. And since the summer, Rouhani and his team has practiced, in my view, a very skillful public diplomacy policy. They have tried through a variety of means to convey the image of moderation, flexibility. They want the world to conclude that these are reasonable guys, we can work with them, we ought to give them the benefit of the doubt, and we shouldn't impose any new sanctions on them, because that could undercut the environment needed for a successful negotiation. I think the last element, trying to convince the world not to impose new sanctions, I think was the key objective of this public diplomacy campaign. which went into high gear in September with the UN General Assembly and President Rouhani's visit to New York to attend that conference. And if you recall, there was a kind of media blitz at the time with Rouhani appearing on just about any TV program that would have him. His very effective, in my view, and professional foreign minister, Javad Zarif, was also on that media circuit. The two of them meeting with all kinds of groups of opinion leaders, non-governmental organizations, simply reaching out to try to convey their message. There was also engagement at senior official levels. There was a meeting of the P5+1 countries with Iran, but at the ministerial level had not been done before. Secretary of State John Kerry attended that meeting, and indeed afterwards, another unprecedented meeting. Secretary Kerry had about 30 minutes with Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister. Apparently it was a very substantive 30-minute discussion. And of course, you all know that toward the end of Rouhani's week in New York, President Obama called him. They spoke on the phone for quite a while. And again, not just pleasantries, but they got into some of the substance of the nuclear issue. These meetings in New York, I think, helped break the ice and served as a prelude for the first P5+1 meeting with Iran at the political directors level, that is, at the sub-cabinet level, since the Iranian presidential election. And that meeting was held in Geneva in October 15, 16. And by all accounts, this two-day meeting went very well. I mentioned it was held at the sub-cabinet level, but Javad Zarif figured he would demonstrate Iran's commitment to a successful outcome by attending the meeting personally. He did. He led off the meeting with a 1-hour PowerPoint presentation laying out a new Iranian position. He did it in English. He attended as U.S. schools as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. He spent, I think, 2 tours at the Iranian mission to the United Nations. He's well acquainted with English, an excellent English speaker. He laid out the Iranian position in this presentation. It didn't have much detail, but some of the more detailed elements of Iran's negotiating position came out in the course of discussions for the remainder of the first and the second days. And interestingly, there was a bilateral meeting between the U.S. and the Iranian delegations. There had been, the last such bilateral meeting was in October 2009, when then Undersecretary Bill Burns met with the chief Iranian negotiator, and the Iranians actually accepted the confidence-building proposal the U.S. and the P5+1 countries had put forward at the time, which was for Iran to export about 75% of the enriched uranium they had produced in exchange for fuel rods for the research reactor in Tehran. They accepted that deal, but when the negotiating team returned to Tehran, they ran into real domestic difficulty, and within 2 weeks, they had backed out of the deal. Ever since then, there have been no meetings of the U.S. and Iran on the margins of these P5+1 meetings. I attended all of those meetings. We had indicated that we would be happy to sit down and talk bilaterally with the Iranians. They refused to do that until now. And so Undersecretary Wendy Sherman met with the Zarif's Deputy Minister Arakshi, for over an hour. Again, a very substantive exchange. So, I mean, the tone, the atmospherics for this two-day meeting in Geneva were very positive, but it was clear at the end of those 2 days that some substantial issues remained. But despite those differences, in my view, there was a convergence between the P5+1 on the one hand and the Iranians on the other on the basic framework for negotiations. And I think this is not explicitly agreed, but it's just my reading of the tea leaves, that there would be two elements of this framework. One would be agreement on the broad outlines, the general elements of a final comprehensive solution on the Iran nuclear issue. The second element would be an initial set of confidence-building measures that would be implemented right away and put in place for about 6 months. And these two agreements would be reached simultaneously, and once the confidence-building package was implemented, for the 6-month period, negotiations would begin on the details of the comprehensive final agreement. So one thing they did accomplish in Geneva was agreement on the next negotiating round, which will be November 7th and 8th, also in Geneva. And later this week in Vienna, experts from both the P5+1 side and the Iranian side will meet to talk about a range of very technical issues regarding constraints on Iran's program and regarding the gradual removal of sanctions. At the November 7th and 8th meeting, again at the sub-cabinet level, they will focus on the two elements of this framework, the initial confidence-building package for 6 months, as well as the general elements of a long-term comprehensive deal. On the initial confidence-building step, the United States and its P5+1 partners are going to want a set of measures that prevent Iran's nuclear program from advancing while negotiations are underway on the comprehensive deal. In February, at the next to last round of negotiations under the old Iranian presidency, the P5+1 partners put forward a package of confidence-building measures, but it was rather narrow. It focused on Iran's production and stockpiling of enriched uranium to about the 20% level, and this previously secret uranium enrichment facility at Fordo. But developments since then have convinced the U.S. and its partners that any initial confidence-building package has to be much broader if it really is to put a halt to advances in the Iranian nuclear program. It would have to cover a reactor that the Iranians are building at a place called Arak, which I believe was intended to produce plutonium for Iran's nuclear weapons program. An initial package would have to halt activities at Arak. It would also have to halt the introduction and enrichment at currently 1,000 new, more advanced centrifuge machines, which can produce enriched uranium much more efficiently than the first generation of machines that are now installed. And there are a variety of things that will have to be done if we really want to stop the Iranian program from advancing during the comprehensive negotiations. So the Almaty proposal from February would have to be significantly expanded in order to do that. And of course, the P5+1 countries know they're going to have to pay a bit more in order to get some more, and what the Iranians will want is more extensive easing of sanctions. in February, when the P5+1 came with its original proposal, the sanctions relief measures they offered were rather limited, including, for example, no new Security Council sanctions against Iran. This wasn't a big deal to the Iranians because they knew the Russians and Chinese could always veto a Security Council resolution. No new European Union sanctions, suspension of U.S. sanctions on petrochemicals and gold and other precious metals. In February, the Iranians regarded these measures as much too limited, and if the P5+1 comes with some expanded requests, for sure, they're going to ask for a lot more in terms of sanctions easing. But the P5+1, and especially the United States, will strongly resist any sanctions easing that gives up crucial leverage to get Iran to agree to an acceptable, comprehensive deal. And the most consequential of the sanctions that are now in place have to do with oil and banking. And I think the U.S. is going to be very resistant to giving up much in those areas. On the November 7-8 meeting, we'll also discuss the elements of a comprehensive deal. And there, the key issue will be uranium enrichment. Uranium enrichment is a dual-use technology. It could be used to enrich uranium to provide fuel for reactors, but it also could be enriched to a very high level, weapons-grade level, to provide the fissile material for nuclear weapons. The Iranians have successfully framed this enrichment issue as a question of rights. They say it's their legitimate right under the Nonproliferation Treaty to have this technology. The U.S. disagrees that the Nonproliferation Treaty provides such a right, and in any event is reluctant to agree to allow Iran to have an enrichment program that could at some point be diverted to the production of weapons-grade uranium. This has been a key contentious issue throughout the years of negotiations, and the Iranians have made a lot of progress in their enrichment program. I think it's inevitable that an agreement, if it is reached, will permit the Iranians to keep an enrichment program. But I think if that's the case, the U.S. and its P5+1 partners will have to be convinced that Iran is prepared to accept the kind of rigorous monitoring measures and the kind of constraints on the size of that enrichment program that could provide some confidence that Iran doesn't have a rapid breakout capability. And by breakout capability, I mean the ability of Iran just to renounce all obligations, to kick out inspectors, turn off all monitoring equipment, and then go very quickly using existing enrichment equipment to produce enough highly enriched uranium for one or more nuclear weapons, and to do all of that quickly enough so that the international community doesn't have the opportunity to stop them, including by the use of military force. The U.S. believes that only a highly constrained enrichment program could possibly limit the potential of Iranian breakout. So on both sides of this framework, the near-term confidence-building package and the long-term comprehensive agreement, there'll be some serious discussions in Geneva in early November. But I think it's going to be tough to resolve some of these issues. Interestingly, both the United States and Iran use almost the same words to indicate what their bottom lines are. They say that no deal is better than a bad deal. The problem is that both sides have very, very different views on what constitutes a bad deal. Other countries are going to be watching these negotiations very carefully. Members of the broad international sanctions coalition are going to be watching to see what the prospects are for a deal that could result in the relaxation of sanctions. And when I say the International Sanctions Coalition, I'm referring to a very broad group of countries, not just the United States and the European Union, but China, India, South Korea, Japan, Turkey, South Africa, and many countries around the world, the United Arab Emirates, countries that have purchased and reduced their purchases of crude oil from Iran, that engage in financial dealings with Iran. All these countries are going to be watching carefully what happens. Some of them have made real sacrifices to impose sanctions on Iran, and they're looking for an opportunity to relax those sanctions. The Gulf Arab countries are going to be watching the negotiations carefully there too. They're terribly concerned that what the U.S. and its partners may do is conclude a deal with Iran whereby Iran gives up its nuclear program if the U.S. and its partners acquiesce in a greater Iranian role in the region. The Gulf Arabs, especially the Saudis and the Emiratis, are very nervous about the U.S. Kind of anointing Iran as the regional hegemon. Israel, of course, will be watching the negotiations very carefully. They're concerned that the P5+1 countries will give away too much of its negotiating leverage prematurely in terms of sanctions relief, and will not be demanding enough of the Iranians in terms of the constraints that Iran must accept on its nuclear program. There will be domestic audiences watching very carefully too, in the U.S. and in Iran. The U.S. Congress in particular has been and still is highly skeptical of any deal with the Iranians, given Iran's erratic track record of compliance with its existing and past obligations. The Congress is on the verge of adopting a new wave of sanctions. The House adopted a strong measure this summer. The Senate is getting ready to mark up a bill that would also impose tough sanctions on Iran. The administration is taking the view with senior members of Congress that it may be necessary to strengthen the sanctions on Iran, but for the time being, it's best if Congress holds off. Give the administration and its partner governments an opportunity to see whether Iran is serious and flexible in negotiating a deal on the nuclear issue. We'll see how this comes out. It's not at all certain that Congress is going to give the administration the running room that it would like to have. Iranian domestic audiences will be watching this very carefully. The supreme leader has ultimate authority on the nuclear issue, but he has constituencies that he has to satisfy too, and many of them strongly oppose an agreement. President Rouhani received criticism in Tehran for even accepting the phone call from President Obama. There's been a poster campaign on the streets of Tehran with opponents of the United States and of negotiations, putting posters all around the country, and the government, at least so far, insisting that those posters be taken down. Iran has politics too. They're a different kind of politics than we have in this country, but they have their politics too, and the supreme leader feels that his room for maneuver could be constrained by those politics. So the road ahead isn't easy at all, but I still think it's possible to have an initial framework agreement sometime before the end of this year. It won't be a perfect agreement. It's going to be criticized in the United States, in Israel, in the Gulf region, and in Iran. In my view, the best way of looking at this is not comparing what is likely to result from the negotiations with some ideal agreement, the best possible agreement we can imagine, but to compare it to some alternative means of dealing with the Iran nuclear issue, including means such as the use of military force and actively promoting regime change in Iran, which, if successful, and it's unlikely to be successful, wouldn't necessarily mean any change in Iran's attitudes toward a nuclear weapons capability. And I think if you judge it by these more realistic standards, against what the alternative means are, I think it's possible that before too long these negotiations can succeed.
Okay, we do have time for questions. Let me just start by coming back to what you were saying about politics within Iran, because we've been hearing that quite a bit this morning too. Is it your understanding that the Supreme Leader has bought into the principle of coming to a deal with the P5+1 so that the sanctions can be lifted, and that the problem there are other elements around him that don't want it? Do we understand what his position is on this?
I don't think we have any precise understanding. I've imagined a discussion between Rouhani and the Supreme Leader where Rouhani kind of lays out the predicament they're in, look, boss, or whatever he calls the Supreme Leader. We got to make a change. People want us to make a change. If we don't do this, situation's going to get worse. Here's my approach. And he kind of lays out the view that through moderation and flexibility, he may be able to divide the international community, divide the P5+1. This is the smart way to go. We can soften them up. We can get a better deal this way. We don't have to give up much of our nuclear program. And the leader responding that, look, you can't trust the Americans. They're not interested in just a nuclear deal. They're interested in regime change. They're not going to really lift the sanctions. They're going to keep them on until until the regime collapses. But if you really believe that your new approach is going to work, okay, go ahead, see what you can do. Give it a try. But you don't have an unlimited time to do that. And I want to be able to say, I told you so. I mean, I think it's a very grudging kind of green light for Rouhani to go ahead. I wouldn't say he's fully enthusiastic about this new approach.
Thank you. Okay, we do have time for questions. Yes, Brenda. I think maybe you need a microphone. Yes?
So I'd like to follow up on Professor Sten's question. If the U.S. government really doesn't know what the mechanism is, maybe there's actually a different conversation, which is good cop, bad cop. I mean, as you said correctly, Khamenei, the spiritual leader, is the ultimate authority on everything in the country, but especially in anything connected to national security matters, military matters. Just like this, under the smiling president of Khatami, the nuclear program was accelerated. Under Ahmadinejad, he united the sanctions effort against Iran while not actually doing that as much for the program as a smiling president did. Maybe this is good cop, bad cop, and the idea that Rouhani is some independent force that influences the spiritual leader when he's hand-picked candidate of the system. Why would you guys see this as two competing forces, and rather maybe it's one force working quite sophisticatedly?
It would be a very sophisticated coordination that they've been able to implement so far. I mean, there's in the newspapers, in the conservative press, there's strong criticisms of what's going on. I mean, I think there are real differences. I don't see this as a well orchestrated good cop, bad cop approach. I think there are real differences on how to deal with the West. I think there's a significant group of Iranians that believe that engagement is the only way their country is going to succeed. There's another group that believes that engagement is the end of the road for the Islamic Revolution. I think there are real differences. I don't think it's a coordinated act here.
Yes.
So Alex Peterson from the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks for your remarks, Mr. Einhorn. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the effect on Iran's neighbors on the regional situation, because it seems, in my analysis at least, that since Rouhani came to power, we've seen a softening of the approach to the United States, to the West, but a hardening of the approach to some of Iran's neighbors, maybe more of a regional strategy developing, and I'm thinking particularly to the north in the Caspian region, but also in Bahrain and other places as well. So what is the fallout for Iran's neighbors of this sort of thawing? Thanks.
Well, I'm sure you and many other people in the audience understand the implications for the Caucasus region much better than I do. I haven't really followed the reaction either of Iran, Iran to its neighbors to the north and northwest, or to the Caucasus governments to the election and the more positive, moderate image that Iran has tried to project. I've been more familiar with the Gulf Arabs' reaction, and they are very, very nervous. And they put this together not just with what they see as the prospect of a U.S.-Iranian rapprochement. They put it together with other things that they are seeing in the region, with their concerns about Syria and what they see as a weak American approach on Syria. They put it together with the withdrawal from Iraq and the impending withdrawal from Afghanistan. They put this all together, and a number of them have gotten very alarmed about these trends. And they're not as focused as the Israeli government on the particulars of a nuclear deal. They're just concerned with, any deal may be achieved at their expense in terms of the role that Iran would play in the region. And I'm not as aware of, as a number of you I'm sure are, of what you portrayed as a kind of hardening, or at least not a softening, of the Iranian attitude toward its Gulf neighbors. It's interesting to me, but I'm not aware of that, simply.
Other questions, comments?
There's one over there.
Sorry? Oh, yeah, I
You're
can't see.
hidden.
Please. Sorry, I didn't see you, Ken.
Okay. Hi, Ken Yalowitz. I'd like to ask you something that you didn't get into very much, and that is within the P5+1, the prospects for unity moving forward. When Iran starts putting things out on the table, how united are we going to be? Because I can imagine some fairly serious problems in that regard.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Ahmadinejad and the position that Iranians were taking before the election were unifiers. I mean, they made it very easy to maintain cohesion among this diverse group of countries. Even though the Russians and Chinese were not enthusiastic about the sanctions regime, they were prepared to acquiesce in these sanctions, as long as we didn't sanction Russian or Chinese companies, because they saw Iran as the intransigent party, and they believed that pressures were necessary to get the Iranians to negotiate more seriously. So there's been a lot of unity until now. Undoubtedly, what Iran would like to do is to divide the P5+1. And this more moderate approach, image, I think contains a number of risks for the unity of the P5+1. I hear from senior American officials that at this first Geneva event, October 15, 16, the six governments hung together pretty well. But we'll see as time goes on and what kind of specific proposals are being made. I know the U.S. and France in particular will be very demanding in terms of the elements of both an interim deal and a comprehensive deal. We will insist on very rigorous limits on an enrichment program if we do, in fact, agree to an enrichment program. But I can see, the Russians and Chinese not being quite as picky as we will be, and this could lead to some difficulties. But I think the Iranians understand that they don't get a deal unless the U.S. is satisfied with the deal. And so even if some of our partners take softer positions, I think the Iranians are realistic enough to know that it's the U.S. sanctions program that has to be. The U.S. sanctions program is at the heart of the international sanctions regime. And it doesn't matter what the others do if the U.S. insists on keeping those sanctions in place. So I think there's worry in the administration about splitting of the P5+1. But I think at the end of the day, the other P5+1 members will go along with whatever the U.S. is prepared to, insist upon.
I think there was another question back there. Yeah. You and then, right, you and then you.
Charlie Perkins from APAC. Dr. Einhorn, you've been working this issue for a very long time. We've seen deals come and go, and as you very well know, 10 years ago, the then EU3 reached a deal, and there was a temporary suspension. Do you fundamentally believe that if there is an agreement and the various restrictions, there's sanctions relief and there's various restrictions on the program, does this really indicate a fundamental change in Iranian strategic feelings towards a nuclear capability? In other words, you look at Syria now, and it seems as if Assad, for whatever reason, really made a fundamental decision to give up CW. And you can maybe make the argument with Gaddafi 10 years ago as well. Is this just a tactical move if they come to an agreement and the Iranians are saying, look, we're under a lot of pressure, let's make a deal now, and somehow, we don't know how, down the road, we'll find our way to ultimately achieve a breakout capability? Or is this really a fundamental shift in their thinking?
This is a very important question. My sense is that, well, let me back up. What is Iran's current approach toward nuclear weapons? I have no doubt but that at the beginning of their covert program in the 80s, this was a nuclear weapons program that, they were in the midst of a terrible war with Iraq, where Iraq was correctly seen to be seeking nuclear weapons of its own. It would be understandable if this covert enrichment program was designed to lead to an Iranian nuclear weapons capability. In 2003, and there's good information about this, the Iranians, concerned about the U.S. invasion of Iraq and thought they were next, decided to suspend at least one of the elements of their nuclear weapons program, the so-called weaponization part of it, while they continued with their missile systems and their enrichment programs and so forth. I think at that time that was a nuclear weapons program deferred rather than a program abandoned. I think at the moment the weapons program is on hold, and they're waiting and seeing what happens. I think they saw that they had covert programs, the covert facilities, the Natanz plant, the Fordo plant, both exposed. They realize it may be hard for them to hide a big facility, and their costs at being found cheating. So I think they're the program is on hold for the time being, and they will see what happens from here. Surely there are Iranian advocates of early weaponization. I think they're looking for an opportunity until when the coast is clear. But I think it's hard to know where it goes from here. If the Iranians agree to a deal that the U.S. and others consider acceptable, I don't think it will be that they've made a fundamental, irrevocable decision against nuclear weapons. I think they will still want to have this as an option for the future. And so they will want to keep, the possibility and some of the infrastructure required for a nuclear weapons program. Our objective needs to be to back them as far away from that threshold as possible, and to ensure that any decision they take to break out of constraints is detectable immediately, and that there's a long period of time that it would take Iran to move from that decision to the production of enough fissile material for one or more weapons. It's got to be a fairly long period of time, and there needs to be the opportunity for the U.S. and others to intervene, if necessary, with military means to stop them at that point. So I think, if there's a sweet spot for a deal, it will be a substantial lengthening of this breakout timeline, but it won't, from an Iranian perspective, preclude their ever having a nuclear weapons capability in the future. But, we want them to regard that decision as a very risky one, because it's going to involve a lengthy period of time in which they will be exposed to the risk of military attack. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Question there?
Alexander Melgishvili, IHS. I was wondering if you can comment on Turkey's role in all of this. At various points of time, Turkey was quite active trying to resolve this issue, and I was wondering how would you assess its role in the current context? Thank you.
Okay. I think the Turks have pulled back considerably from an activist role on this issue. They earlier had a very activist role. I referred to this two-week agreement on the Tehran research reactor in October 2009. The Turks, working with the Brazilians, wanted to find some way forward. They finally, in May of 2010, they got the Iranians to agree to the proposal we made to them back in October 2009. We were not very happy about this Turkish-Brazilian initiative, because we had told them very clearly that the proposal back in October 2009 was no longer, it had become outdated because of the accumulation of more enriched uranium. And yet the Turks and Brazilians went ahead anyway. Why did they do that? I think because at that moment, in May of 2010, the UN Security Council were considering a very big sanctions resolution. The Brazilians and the Turks were on the Security Council, and they made no bones about it. They wanted to derail this sanctions resolution, and they thought by doing this initiative, they could defeat any effort to impose stronger sanctions. So we, the U.S. wasn't comfortable with this initiative. We couldn't accept it. It had become outdated. And we weren't very happy. When the resolution in the Security Council was adopted in June, it passed by 13 votes to 2, with all permanent members of the Security Council, including Russia and China, voting for it, and Brazil and Turkey voting against. We took that as not a terribly friendly act, and we expressed our discomfort, to those governments. And I think since then there hasn't been much enthusiasm. You've had a change. Lula, Lula's no longer head of Brazil, and Brazil, this activism was largely a function of his personal role. Erdogan, I think, has lost enthusiasm as the Turks have been involved in regional politics that have had much higher priority, especially Syria and so forth. So there just isn't the activism we see from the Turks that we saw 3-4 years ago.
Thank you. We have time for one more question over there.
Thank you, Emin Ibrahimov from the Embassy of Azerbaijan. Mr. Einhorn, you referred to concerns of certain regional countries regarding engagement of the United States with Iran. Do you think that these mounting concerns can somehow affect negotiations if those negotiations drag on? And do you think the United States talks enough to its regional traditional partners as it pushes for a deal with Iran?
Say the second part again, please.
And do you think that United States talks enough to its regional traditional partners as it pushes for a deal with Iran? Thanks.
On the second part, no, I don't think the administration has consulted closely enough with its partners throughout all of the partners that surround Iran. I think it could have done a lot more and should be doing a lot more, especially during this period of intensive engagement with Iran. I think we have to address these concerns. I think that's very important. If the talks drag on, I think, well, I don't think the talks are going to drag on very long. I think there will be agreement by the end of the year, at least on a framework, or it will become clear that Iran really isn't quite as flexible as it's trying to project at the moment. And then I think we have to go on to a different stage altogether. So I don't think they're going to drag on very long. But if they do, I think this is going to lead to more suspicions and difficulties with America's partners throughout the region. And I think one way to deal with that is to anticipate it now and begin much more intensive consultations than we've undertaken so far.
Okay, well, on that note, please join me in thanking Robert Einhorn for a very